The cathedral was full of light and soft murmurs, but in Clare's world every sound boiled down to one thing: the clip of satin against marble as she took another step toward the altar. Her dress whispered. The bouquet trembled in her hands. Faces blurred into a gold halo of cameras and velvet smiles. Then Gavin stepped forward and the air changed. "You're nothing," he said. 3 words, perfectly spaced. The room ceased to breathe. The minister's voice stalled on the next line. For a moment those words hung between Clare and the life she had been arranging in her chest like fragile glass. They were supposed to be building a home. Instead, his voice cracked it. Laughter rose from the pew nearest the Hartwells. Sharp, practiced, a chorus of approval for humiliation. Amanda smirked. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes glittered like cut glass. Richard Hartwell leaned back in his chair as if watching a well-rehearsed play, amusement on his face, as if Clare's collapse were only an inconvenient prop. Clare felt the bouquet slip, felt petals scatter against the marble. Champagne sloshed somewhere behind her, an iced glass knocked by a clumsy hand. Someone hissed, "Pathetic," as though that word could finish her. She sank to her knees because the timing of falling felt less catastrophic than the alternative. Standing and trying to understand how someone who had shared coffee and late-night study sessions and small jokes could say such things with that steady, quiet cruelty. The cathedral's marble bit cold into her palms. The organ, meant to lift and sustain, sounded distant and wrong. This was not how it was supposed to be. If this grabs you, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. She could see Gavin's mouth moving, but his words slid off the room like oil. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward. A hand, too deliberate, tipped a flute of champagne. The bubbles spilled like a tiny glittering waterfall across the hem of Clare's dress. A hush, then a ripple of cruel little clucks and sympathetic whispers, the kind people make when they want to be seen on the right side of whatever verdict the room has just handed down. Clare's face was wet. Tears, champagne, something that felt like the end of a long experiment on patience. She could catalog every sensation in clinical terms later: the wetness at her temple, the sour scent of spilled alcohol, the way shoes scuffed suddenly on polished stone. Right then there was only an enormous private ache. Beneath it, a tread of something colder: disbelief, and beneath that, a thin ledge of recognition. She had seen the signs before. She had ignored them. Gavin's jaw was tight. His eyes did not meet hers. He had been a kindness at first. The boy with the shy laugh and the book under his arm. The boy who praised her essays. Who stayed until dawn in quiet libraries because she could argue and organize and finish what he started. She had, at some point, mistaken his attention for something other than usefulness. At the far end of the nave, the oak doors loomed like the hinge between 2 lives. Between the city's polished public future and the small, stubborn world Clare had thought was her refuge. She did not know that those doors would open before the guests had finished rearranging their faces into the version the day required. She only felt the cold of the floor, the hush of a congregation, the finality of a man who had chosen to offer cruelty instead of companionship. There are moments that split a life in 2 before and after. This felt like one. Her outburst of breath came when she realized she could still hear her father's voice in a message left some weeks earlier, calm as a closed book. "Be honest," he had said. "Look for how they treat you when nothing's obvious. Watch family, not faces." She had nodded over the phone because the voice of William Bennett on a call sounded like reason. She had thought she understood what he meant. She had been wrong about how much could be hidden behind hospitality. She tasted metal and shame. The Hartwell's camera lenses captured the smear of champagne like a gallery of accusation. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward as if for a better angle. A friend she had invited from university fumbled with a napkin and said nothing. Someone muttered, "What a spectacle," and meant it as entertainment. Clare could have risen. She could have thrown off the dress and walked out on her own terms. For a second she imagined doing that, but the weight of the moment tethered her. She had wanted so much to be seen that the very idea of leaving when everyone watched felt unfairly theatrical. She bowed her head and let the hot thinness of her upset move through her bones like a weather system. The light changed again, and the cathedral doors thundered open. They did not open with the polite rattle of a late guest. They exploded into the room like a judgment. Oak slamming against marble, heels clacking now on the aisle. The room recoiled. William Bennett walked in with a measured step that pulled the air taut. He wore a coat cut like authority and the sort of quiet that makes rooms rearrange themselves. He was not loud. He did not need to be. The congregation shifted as if a wind had passed. Cameras found him, then found the man behind him. Security, composed expressions, an efficiency that turned the moment into something less like a random interruption and more like a planned entry. Where Mrs. Hartwell had been all performance and relish, William was all control. The kind of control that had not yet been put on display. He scanned the room with eyes used to weighing promises against clauses, questions against answers. Then he looked at Clare. A line softened at the corner of his mouth, and Clare felt something steady move through her. Not rescue. There would be no theatrical grappling and swooping up. It was steadier than that. The presence of someone who had seen more plays than the audience and recognized the set. "You should know," William said, his voice carrying clearly through the hush. "Some things are not what they seem." The Hartwells laughed at the wrong time. It stuck in their throats. Some sounds have the stubbornness of a liar unmasked. The laughter curdled. Faces that had been bright with assumed victory paled. Richard Hartwell's smile went brittle, as if someone had opened a window to let in an unexpected breeze. He shifted and, in that motion, revealed the calculation that had been his secret currency, the kind of arithmetic that measures people by their utility more than by their personhood. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he hoped the day would seal a merger between family and fortune. William's arrival felt like an index of the Bennett world, calm, precise, quietly severe. He took a step forward, not toward confrontation but toward truth. "I'm William Bennett," he said, and the name landed like a title page being read aloud. It had weight. It rewired the room's listening. The Hartwells' mouths opened and closed without a sound. The minister stopped, unwilling to tangle themselves in anything that looked like a feud between titans. People reached for their phones, a reflexive move to record or to prove that they had been present for this, that they had been close enough to touch the turning of a life. Clare blinked and saw her mother at her side. Her hand was a small, certain thing that squeezed once, a private anchor. For a heartbeat, she wanted to lean into that squeeze and melt, to let years of exhaustion drip from her bones and be lessened with something as simple as touch. The weight of her history, the scholarship, the apartment where she and her mother shared the rent, the nights of study illuminated by a single desk lamp, came up behind her like a chorus. These were the things that had taught her how to stand when the room asked for kneeling. She had been schooled in endurance. William's gaze did not seek vengeance, it sought explanation. He addressed the room with a calm that made the chandeliers seem to dim around his words. "There are things you should know about this estate," he said, and his voice had the cool certainty of someone who keeps legal counsel at a walk's length and instruments of accountability at their disposal. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The claim was a quiet bomb. Clare had been told stories about him. The billionaire who protected from a distance, the father who taught lessons through tests, who favored restraint over spectacle. She had laughed nervously at those stories, because they sounded like fables told over brandy, at the kind of tables where William Bennett never actually sat. But he had been more present than she allowed herself to admit. The phone call last month, the brief visit between semesters, the way he paused conversations like a man making notes in his mind, that had all been part of his method. The Hartwells exchanged glances, collars rising like defensive fins. Richard's hands closed around his program. Amanda adjusted her gloves as though the day's choreography required her to appear unbothered. The room awaited the unraveling. "You should know," William said again, precisely, "that this estate's title is not what you think." Gasps moved like a tide. Some guests began to murmur, uncertain whether the interruption was part of the ceremony's flourish. Others, sensing scandal, leaned forward. Clare's knees pressed into marble, but her mind no longer felt hollow. It tightened. A thread in her chest wound itself into watching. She had spent so long trying to be generous and to be unseen. Claire's life before the altar had been constructed from small choices that were never small. At 20, she arrived at a state university with a scholarship, a worn backpack, a head full of logic, and the faint stubbornness of children raised to believe excellence was the way out of being overlooked. She studied economics because it had the same clean rationality she liked in chess moves. She loved the taste of a solved problem, the quiet satisfaction of a paper that balanced argument with evidence. Gavin had been at her table on a rain-damp evening in the library. He showed up with 2 coffees, apologetic and earnest. He had a way with numbers that delighted him, but it was Claire's mind he admired. He praised the patterns in her notes, matched her step for step through material that made other students glaze over. They started with study sessions that ran into the night. The line between friendship and something warmer thinned not from drama but from repeated kindnesses. A text to ask how she was after a long day, the glance that conveyed he'd noticed when she stayed home sick. He admired her in public and privately, and Clare mistook admiration for belonging. There was a sincerity there she didn't think to question. He introduced her to his parents, to ornate dinners where napkins were folded like folded invitations into a life she had only glimpsed before. The Hartwells' house smelled of lemonwood and power. Clare felt small in those rooms, not because of the linens, but because people there measured value differently. Her father, William, watched with a particular deliberateness. He encouraged her to be cautious. People reveal themselves when nothing is at stake. He'd told her once, and she thought of that often. It had been part prudence, part strategy. He'd wanted more for her than a match on paper. He wanted a husband who would build with her, not with her as a saleable asset. So, when Richard Hartwell approached his daughter's engagement with an offer that smelled of leverage, William listened the way a chess master does to a new move. The Hartwells needed something. Contracts had frayed. An empire can feel brittle when the right partner walks away or refuses a hand. Richard's solution was tidy in his mind, a union between the families that could re-anchor deals and soothe investors. It required a match. It required a bride the Hartwells could present as desirable. It required Clare, bright, modest, serious as a living emblem of respectability. There were moments when Clare thought she was loved. There were other moments. Conversations glimpsed behind half-closed doors, the way Gavin's tone shifted when his parents entered a room, when she began to see the scaffolding for a marriage that was less about affection and more about alignment. The small kindnesses withered into appointments on calendars. Compliments turned into inventory of her uses, school's prestige, family name, the possibility of smoothing tensions with other parties who wanted a seat at the Hartwell table. She told herself she could fix it with earnestness. She believed in the power of conversation. She thought if she spoke plainly they would hear the person she was, the woman who had postponed celebrations, who had finished entire dissertations at 2 a.m., who had learned to be generous in ways that had required grit. She believed hearts could be moved by evidence of care. Richard considered her a variable. He measured returns. He had turned to his son and offered reassurance with a peculiar currency. If you did what needed to be done, if you made the right choices, benefits would follow. For a man like him, marriage was a platform. When the Hartwells plotted, they kept their feelings in a separate ledger. And then came the meeting in a glass conference room where the city looked small below the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard had 2 problems, a failing flagship contract and a board pressure that liked immediate numbers. He wanted a fix that would show stability, and he thought of marriage as an immediate balance sheet. He wanted Clare to be a face that reflected favor. Consider it a partnership, he had told Gavin, in a voice that suggested a favor rather than asking for moral compromise. You help us reposition, we help you secure a foothold. You marry up and the world makes sense again. He spoke about influence as if it were a commodity that could be traded like any other. Gavin swallowed. It was easier sometimes to align with the current than to stand against it. He had not seen himself as cruel. He saw himself as pragmatic. In that glass room, he made the choice to prioritize a future he could control over a present that challenged him. He promised Richard things, promises that smelled like paper and calculation. He told himself he could play both sides. He told himself he loved Clare and that the marriage would be the proof. He had begun to think of Clare as an addition to his strategy rather than the center of his life. When Clare invited Gavin into the small apartment where she cooked 2 dishes from memory and taught him how she liked her coffee, he'd laughed and said, "You have rules about everything, don't you?" and kissed her with such sweetness she believed him. Even then, William watched and took notes only with the distance of a father who prefers to see what a man will do when his rewards are both immediate and delayed. A test, William thought, is not the same as an interrogation. It is a way to see where the true priorities stand. Clare could not have known another test was unfolding in the Hartwells' corridors, one that used her like a pawn. Richard whispered to his wife that a spectacle could knead public opinion back into alignment. Amanda whispered to friends that the Hartwells needed to remain untarnished. Plans were laid in the soft light of rooms that had never known struggle. Their cruelty was not loud. It was the quiet arithmetic of people who had never had to measure another's pain. The wedding day had been chosen as much for optics as for commitment. A cathedral, an evening reception in Hartwell Gardens, speeches that would be quoted in the business pages. Investors would see a family renewed by a promising match. The Hartwells rehearsed their smiles. Gavin swallowed what he had to swallow and rehearsed his lines, not the ones about love, but the lines that would convince the right people he could hold a family together. Clare was unaware of most of this. She had faith in the rituals that had seen couples through generations. She had faith, naive and stubborn, in small things, an apology after an argument, a hand held while crossing a street, that she thought were the building blocks of marriage. She imagined a life that would be a garden of shared work and small routines. Her father had not promised to arrange everything for her. He had taught her to read people. He had cautioned her. She had heard but watched the world with the young hope people rarely unlearn. The week before the ceremony, there were dinners at the Hartwell mansion. Clare noticed the odd jokes, the way Amanda's compliments landed like veiled tests. Gavin was distracted in a way that felt like the distance of a man measuring returns. The house smelled of lemonwood and the gloss of long-stewed money. It was opulence she had admired from afar and tried to navigate with polite curiosity. Once, over a meal, Richard said something that sounded like a benediction and landed like a threat. "A family must preserve itself," he said, sweeping bread across a platter. "Sometimes we take measures that feel uncomfortable to preserve stability." He smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach eyes. Clare listened politely. She was drained by the undercurrent, but hopeful it would be smoothed by the ceremony itself, by the public sealing of promises. She was wrong. Back in the present, the cathedral's air felt suddenly brittle. William's words had dropped a stone in the middle of the day. Guests shifted, some craning for better angles, as if the drama might be monetized. Gavin's face was a model of conflict, but his body betrayed him. It had already aligned to the comfort of his parents' counsel. He did not reach for Clare. He kept his hands neatly at his sides. The congregation watched, a living jury. "You're nothing," he had said. The words evaporated in the arrival of a revelation. The Hartwells' laughter died when William spoke, yet the damage had been done. The stain of those words could not be washed away by revelation. They had settled like a film over Clare's trust. William stood there, a man who could buy and sell headlines if he wished, and still chose to speak in a tone that belonged to truth rather than vengeance. "The title," he said slowly, each syllable measured, like laying chess pieces. "The title to this estate sits in my daughter's name. The house you stand in, this property, has been held for her." A collective breath inhaled across the crowd. The Hartwells' faces, last week so composed for the cameras, unmade themselves into something raw. Amanda's fingers tightened on the program. Richard's jaw clenched. For years, William had watched. He had seen teachers who praised his daughter, mentors who lifted her, worried at times when the world seemed eager to underestimate her. He had kept his hand at a distance. He had warned. He had been present in ways Clare mistook for absence, because his lessons were patient and his methods discreet. "There are consequences," he said, looking neither triumphant nor cruel. "We will let them play out." There were murmurs about legalities, about how titles could be held and how company deals could shift like weather. People with feeds to maintain and reputations to protect checked their phones. Cameras panned the room like hungry birds. The Hartwells' guests murmured about scandal in low, colorful tones that only meant one thing to those who lived for stories. This would be on feeds before the night was over. Clare tried to feel relief. It rose like a tide of something brittle. Part of the relief was simple and human. She was no longer alone under the heavy eye of family scorn. The other part, the heavier part, was that the very thing she had tried to protect, her dignity, felt revealed in a way she neither asked for nor desired. Her father's actions did not rescue her from the humiliation. They reframed it. That reframe hurt in a new way. She wanted the cruelty to be punished, but she also wanted the raw, private truth, that she had been in love with a man who could say such things, that she had misread the shape of his affection. That hurt was not a thing for headlines. It would remain in small, quiet places where no one took pictures. William's intervention was the pivot that would tilt lives. But a pivot does not translate into instant justice. There would be investigations, statements issued, reputations managed. There would be legal maneuvers and PR teams scrambling to put out fires. There would be people in suits who traded in delay. William knew that. He also knew some things money cannot buy. Truth, the steady presence of a daughter harmed in public, the moral balance of exposing a family too willing to discard a person for optics. As the first fissure of possibility opened in the Hartwells' carefully built facade, Clare found it hard not to think of everything that had led here. The library nights, the careful lists, the small hand squeezes from her mother, the moments of doubt she tucked away. There was no glamour in disgrace. There was only the blunt, sharp education of being seen as lesser. She rose then, not because she wanted to reclaim the ceremony, but because standing felt like the only honest posture left. She smoothed the drift of wet silk across her legs, lifted her chin, and met Gavin's eyes. His face was a geography of regret and concealment. He mouthed something that might have been an apology. It sounded like a practice. "You only care now because of who my father is," she said, and the sentence cut clean. It was not a plea. It was the observation of someone who had watched the arithmetic of affection. William's presence in the doorway was both shield and instrument. He had stepped into the room not to show off wealth, but to assert a truth that would force the Hartwells to account for their cruelty. The room hummed with the energy of a public unmasking. People who had come for velvet and vows found themselves witness to a more volatile affair, a reckoning designed by a man who had long since learned the value of timing. On the aisle, Clare's breath slowed. She felt the press of cameras and the whispering wind of reputations leaning over like curious birds. She was exhausted, but not broken. There was an odd clarity in the exposure. If shame had been a heavy fog, then the revelation was a sudden wind. She could not say yet whether she wanted the storm to sweep the Hartwells away, or to leave them to rebuild with the evidence of their cruelty laid out like glass. This was the moment where things turned, where the personal became public and the public would decide whether to watch quietly or to throw stones. The cathedral's acoustics held everything, from the faint rustle of a program to the sharp intake of breath that sounded like a drum roll. Cameras recorded, friends whispered, conspirators betrayed by the tilt of a shoulder. It would not be simple, it would not be clean. William's announcement shifted the ground, but the Hartwells had resources and contacts, and the city liked color. For now, though, the room froze. The Hartwells' plan, if they had indeed planned to humiliate, had miscalculated the one variable they had not accounted for, the possibility that the thing they sought to claim as proof of their status, this house, was not, in fact, entirely in their hands. There was a silence that felt like a held breath before a plunge, and then an edge of movement, security stepping forward slightly, a whisper of paper, a phone held high. The sense of something bigger about to unfold filled the hall like a coming storm. William stood steady. Clare found her voice not in anger, but in the brittle, clean clarity of someone who had learned how to be measured. "You should have treated her like a person," she said softly for those nearest. "Not like a line in a ledger." The words landed and the cathedral hummed with the aftershock. They were not a demand for blood. They were an observation, a moral equation laid bare. Some guests nodded, others diverted their eyes. In the worlds where money moves like tide, You can always find the ones willing to step away and the ones who circle back with statements polished for press release. Clare's mother held her shoulder. The touch was small, intimate. William took a step forward, as if to shield, then thought better of it. Protection, in his mind, had never been spectacle. It had been the long labor of making sure truth could be told when the time came. Outside the cathedral, cars idled like sentinels. Inside, the Hartwells gathered themselves like a force marshalling control. A handshake here, a whispered instruction there. The day had been upended, and the day's management would begin in earnest. For some, this would mean careful language and a composed face. For others, it meant panic measured through the lens of power. Clare stood in that hesitation, the public and private braided together. She was the one in the dress with champagne drying like a strange glitter on the hem. She was also the woman who had studied into the small hours and saved every spare cent. She was the daughter of a man who preferred to act with precision. None of these facts simplified the moment. They complicated it, made it human. The cathedral hummed with the low noise of people deciding which narrative to tell. For Clare, the moment held a different kind of calculus, the choice of whether to rage, to beg, to explain, or to do nothing, and let the truth change the rules. She had been trained to prefer the last, to prefer endurance until there was a clear moment to act. Her father had chosen this moment. He had stepped across the threshold when he decided the lesson could no longer be private. There was an intentionality that made Clare both grateful and wary. She trusted his judgment more than she trusted 1,000 polite smiles. But there remained the knowledge that publicity could heal as much as it hurt. The world could be cruel. It could also be corrective. From the back of the cathedral, a camera flashed like a small, bright star. The Hartwells' guests checked phones and the social feed began to churn. The first headlines would be written before the last vow was murmured. The narrative would begin to shape itself. Betrayal, rich family feud, bride humiliated, billionaire father reveals truth. Clare let the melodies of the organ swell and fall. She thought of the long catalog of little betrayals, texts unanswered, invitations declined, mornings alone. She thought of Gavin's hands, how they had once fit into hers with a shy kind of care, now folded politely at his sides. She thought of her mother's soft voice, of the smell of toast in their small kitchen. She thought of the library where she'd learned to hold an argument. Nothing about retribution would be clean. But there was a certain terrible justice in the moment that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with exposure. She had been dismissed as nothing. Now, the story demanded that nothing be reappraised. The cathedral's light caught on William's face. He looked at the Hartwells, then at his daughter, and something like resolve settled over him. He had orchestrated tests before, small ones, a quiet question, a reviewing of intentions, but he had never before pulled the curtain in such a public place. Clare felt the weight of exposure both like armor and like glass. The crowd leaned in. The first press murmurs began. The Hartwells moved like people who had been surprised by a consequence they had not paid into their ledgers. Richard's mouth pressed into a thin line. Amanda's gloves were suddenly clumsy instruments. For the first time in a long time, they looked undone. Outside, the city shrugged and decided whether to care. Inside, Clare adjusted the wet hem of her gown, rubbed the salt from her cheek, and breathed. The life she had imagined was gone. More precisely, the image of the life as she had imagined it was shattered. What remained was the raw beginning of a different story. She did not know exactly what the ending would be. She only knew this. She would not let herself be measured as nothing again. The cathedral doors stood open like a gate Mr. Bennet had intentionally left ajar. The next moves would be played by people who had more to lose and more to calculate. The Hartwells would decide what defense to mount. The city would watch. Clare would have to choose how loudly she wanted to be heard, and where silence might be stronger than spectacle. For now, there was only the hush after William's words, the soft scuffle of feet, and the slow reorientation of the room. People would file out. Whispers would become headlines, and somewhere in the immediate next hours, the first statements would be drafted. Clare stood in the hush and felt the world tilt. She did not yet know whether the tilt would right her or heap new burdens upon her. But she knew that, for the first time in that room, she had a choice about what to do next. People drifted toward the doors like leaves after a storm. Some hurried, some reluctant, all rearranging the story they would tell tonight. The Hartwells moved with a practiced composure that had been interrupted, then reassembled into damage control. Richard barked instructions into a phone as if directing a crew. Amanda pulled a glove over trembling fingers, and Gavin followed them with the blank, doomed look of someone who had learned too late how to be small. Outside, the evening air washed the cathedral's stones cool. Cameras clustered at the entrance, faces of reporters lit by screens that already pulsed with the early outlines of the narrative. Bride humiliated, billionaire father intervenes, estate title shocks society. The headlines were being written even as the congregation dispersed. William Bennett did not hurry. He closed the space between his family and the departing guests with a calm that made haste unnecessary. Clare's mother leaned into her daughter, steady and human in a way no headline could parody. "Come home," she murmured, and her voice had the plain authority of someone who had carried loss without spectacle for years. They stepped into a black car that smelled of leather and a resigned quiet. The driver eased away from the curb, and the city's hum swallowed them as more voices erupted behind. Phone calls, recorded snippets, the buzz of public attention snapping to life. In the back seat, Clare sat still, her wet gown settling into the leather like an old wound finding its place. William glanced at her, then at the window where the Hartwell property receded into a smudge of manicured hedges and classical stone. "We did what was necessary," he said finally, as if clarifying an arithmetic problem. His voice was careful. There was none of the triumph a stranger might expect. Clare watched his hands, the small calluses that belied a life built on decisions and deferred displays. "You could have told me," she said. The words were blunt with a child's plain complaint and an adult's accusation. "I found out in front of an entire congregation." William's jaw relaxed into a softer calculation. "I wanted you to know men by their behavior, not their manners," he said. "You needed to see what would happen when the stakes were small and when they were very public. It was not meant to break you." "It broke me," Clare answered. There was no theatricality in her voice, only the steady accounting of someone tallying a ledger of hurts. "You used me." He did not argue. He had learned to accept her truth as part of the lesson. "I protected you in ways you could not ask for," he said. "But I should have been more candid about the measures I took. For that—" He reached out and placed a hand lightly over hers, an almost apologetic touch. "I'm sorry." The apology was not a fix. She did not expect apologies to replace the years of small betrayals or the shock of public rejection. It was a necessary moment, though. A father acknowledging the cost of his strategy. Clare allowed herself a breath that let the tautness in her chest settle, if only a fraction. The first night after the cathedral was not a clean victory. The Hartwells retreated into a hive of whispers. Friends posted pale, carefully worded statements. Legal teams, measured anonymous, began drafting lines that could be repeated without meaning. But the glare of a public unmasking is a kind of measure all its own. Investors are petty animals. They prefer calm and predictability. Rumors about shaken contracts and pause in negotiations travel faster than the facts that eventually dull them. Within hours, something practical began to shift. Boards convened, partners called to ask for clarification. A small portfolio of clients, those for whom optics mattered more than loyalty, started to distance themselves from the Hartwell name. The world that trades in confidence hesitates when a trustworthy face becomes a headline. People who had been comfortable in Richard's orbit now hovered at the edge, waiting to see how the tide would run. The Hartwells' first instinct was to claim outrage, to insist that a private family had been made spectacle of. They prepared statements about dignity violated, about smears and character assassination. That line would play to certain audiences. It would not, however, erase the recorded private conversations, texts and emails and boarding passes that had begun to leak like water from a cracked pipe. William Bennett's team, predictably, had been thorough. Raw evidence was an inconvenient thing for men who had measured others as instruments. In the days that followed, the Hartwells found themselves negotiating a new reality. The house they had always regarded as their symbol was, in the eyes of more than a few legal and financial observers, no longer an uncontested emblem under their control. That fact was not a fanciful headline. It was a set of documents, trust agreements, title entries, kept intentionally broad in public language but decisive in implication. William had not spun a fairy tale. The title had been placed in a way he later described to Clare with a blandness that frustrated her. For safekeeping and for eventual transfer, the phrasing left room for interpretation, which was the point. He had built a lawful, unassuming structure that would move like a lever the moment an injustice became public. The Hartwells' confidence faltered. Men who had spoken loudly in boardrooms now left conferences with faces like drained lemons. The family's social calendar contracted. Invitations evaporated. The polite distances of the wealthy, those defensive hedges of optics that looked like friendship, tightened until only those with no reputation to lose remained close. Gavin Hartwell's life reordered around silence. He sent messages that read like fragments of regret and practiced concern. He tried at first to explain, words that fizzed and died against the public weight of what had been said at the altar. Some days he looked like someone who had been stripped of possibility. Other days he appeared arrogant in an attempt to reclaim a surface that had been peeled away. Clare watched him from a distance for a time, an observer who had learned the cost of proximity. "You were never around when it mattered," Clare told him once, when he begged, in a small voice that seemed suddenly too young for his age. "You were always around when it benefited you." His apology, the one he offered when he thought she might still be persuaded, sounded like rehearsal. She did not accept it, and not because she wanted to punish him. She did not accept it because she had learned what acceptance would buy, more of the same calculation dressed as affection. The Hartwells' decline was not cinematic in the way tabloids imagined. There were no sudden bankruptcies with dramatic gongs. There were, instead, a series of small collapses. A major client withdrew an endorsement, a scheduled announcement was postponed indefinitely, an erstwhile ally asked for time to consult counsel. People who had counted on the Hartwell name as a reliable currency discovered that reputations are fragile, and once a crack is visible, buyers grow skittish. At a shareholders' meeting of one of Richard's ventures, the topic of governance came to the fore. A motion was quietly introduced to review leadership and conflict of interest issues, citing an unsettling string of events and a need to preserve shareholder value. The language was bland, clinical, and devastating. Prudence looked like a board politely prying a family's hand from the till. Meanwhile, the cameras that had gathered at the cathedral shot new footage. The Hartwell mansion with its shutters closed, the flurry of staff entering and leaving with boxes and expressions, a town square murmuring with gossip. Amanda's social calendar collapsed. Invitations stopped, and dinners that once moved with ease through rooms of influence found themselves thinly attended. In small neighborhoods away from the press, the consequences touched people who had nothing to do with the family's power plays. Housekeepers, groundskeepers, servers, people who'd worked on the Hartwell estate for decades, felt an anxious uncertainty. William insisted privately that employment and livelihoods be protected, that the hurt inflicted by one family's arrogance not be compounded by economic collateral damage. He instructed his legal and philanthropic teams to ensure stability for those staff, while the accounting of power played out in boardrooms. That decision did not erase the humiliation Clare had endured, but it kept the moral ledger from tilting toward careless cruelty. A week after the cathedral, Clare visited the mansion for the first time since the wedding. Not as a storming conqueror, nor as a triumphant claimant, but because a place that had been the stage for humiliation had also been an emblem of what she now had to reckon with. Both the ruin heaped upon her and the inconvenient truth that she, by legal instrument, had a claim there. She stepped into an entry hall that smelled like citrus polish and old money, a smell that used to feel like a foreign language. The staff, some faces she recognized, others knew, met her with a mixture of deference and curiosity. This was the surreal part of power. It was quiet and bureaucratic and edged with an intimacy that made her stomach do small, unfamiliar flips. An assistant led her through rooms she remembered from dinners and small, anxious laughter. Sunlight slanted across a table where a napkin had once been folded with a showy flourish. It was the same place where she had once been instructed in the grammar of a house that did not, until now, answer to her name. But the name was there. The papers that William had arranged were discreet, language like held in trust, transferable interest, phrasing meant to be resolute without spectacle. It was, as William had promised, an instrument of protection more than a theatrical trump card. "You own this," the assistant said awkwardly, translating legal quiet into human surprise. "I do," Clare answered. The words felt heavy with history, with salt and the weight of a moment. She did not feel delight. She did not feel vindictive pleasure. She felt a complex, steady thing, responsibility. William watched her as she walked through rooms with the slow, private attention of someone learning an inheritance and its obligations. "You can do what you want with it," he told her. "You can keep it. You can sell it. You can open it. I placed it in your name to protect you and those you care about from being used." She sat in a drawing room where a portrait watched like an ancestor who did not have to license opinion. "Why here?" she asked. "Why the house and not something else?" He smiled with the familiarity of men who teach lessons through objects. "Because people who measure others by appearances misunderstand what homes really hold," he said. "They thought this house made them. They were wrong." Clare's fingers traced the curve of an armchair. The room hummed with a peculiar quiet, a space where the architecture of power met the brittle human confessions that had been shouted amid organ pipes. She thought of the nights she'd spent studying until dawn, of the strange economy of small sacrifices, of the ways people are offered ladders that are not built for all. She thought, too, of the people who had stood by her, her mother, a few friends from university, a professor who had written a letter about character rather than credentials. Those were the small currencies of life that had held when flashy endorsements had lurched away. In the months that followed, Clare made choices that surprised even her. She did not convert the mansion into a spectacle. She did not publish a manifesto or demand a torchlit demolition of the Hartwell name. She began instead with small, ordinary things. She wrote letters of reassurance to staff whose paychecks had been at risk. She met with neighbors who had been anxious about what the public scandal might mean for their block. She sat with her mother on a small couch and talked sometimes about what dignity looked like in ordinary living. There were practical moves, of course. The estate's management was placed under oversight while questions were investigated. Contracts were reviewed. A temporary board was installed by consensus of stakeholders who could no longer pretend the optics did not matter. The language used in public statements remained careful and bland. But in private, consequences settled. Consultants unfurled audits like measuring tapes. Partners requested clarity and accountability, and the Hartwells found their sphere of unquestioned influence narrowed. Richard Hartwell did not go quietly into erasure. He fought with a peculiar combination of entitlement and panic. He spoke to investors, pleaded to allies, and attempted to salvage narratives that had once served him. There were moments of sharp public humiliation for him, short televised snippets of his staccato attempts at explanation, his careful phrasing crumbling under the weight of recorded evidence and the press's appetite for contradictions. Amanda, who had once delighted in others' discomfort as if it were a social game, found herself with fewer invitations and colder eyes. Gavin was left picking through the shards. He tried to reach Clare more than once, with little envelopes and messages that read like confessions rehearsed under lights. Each attempt landed badly. For Clare, his words were not the repair she needed. She had learned to separate apology from the work it takes to become the kind of person one could truly love. The problem, she realized, had not been a single outrage. It had been the long, little domestications of moral courage into behaviors that served convenience. At a small private dinner months later, Clare sat across from a few friends who had been there before the scandal. They laughed in that way people do when they reclaim normalcy, a small laugh that felt like a key in a lock. She told them she was thinking of doing something with the estate that was less about showing and more about doing. Ideas tumbled, a program for young women from modest backgrounds to learn business skills, a scholarship in her mother's name, a small fellowship for students who needed quiet spaces to work without the pressure of performance. The house, she decided, should be a place that made room rather than a monument that measured. Word leaked, of course. The press enjoys redemption plots as much as scandal. Some articles framed her as the heiress who forgave, others as the woman who weaponized wealth. Clare did not court the cameras. She did not write op-eds. She let the work happen in small, interior ways, meetings with program directors, notes written late into the night, careful contracts to protect staff, and to ensure that any changes did not ripple into unemployment for those who had served the house for years. People liked tidy moral arcs, but life resists tidy endings. There were legal nightmares, delays and disputes lodged by those who had relied on the old order. There were social barbs, former friends writing hurtful op-eds about privacy and privilege, commenters on feeds debating whether a billionaire father had helped or harmed his daughter's agency. Clare read some of it and did not much care. She had learned to keep distance from the loud thinking of strangers. The real work, she knew, was closer to home, supporting the staff, ensuring continuity for employees, and making choices that aligned with a sense of right rather than spectacle. Her mother watched her with a mixture of fierce pride and small tenderness. "You didn't make this about shame," she said once, folding laundry in a kitchen that smelled of lemon and grounded simple food. "You made it about care." Clare smiled, a thin thing that held both iron and a softness her father could never quite manufacture. "I won't make my life a revenge," she said. "That's not the point. The point is that people learn to measure others differently, because they have to." When the dust settled enough for quiet, the Hartwells' social perch had lowered. Richard exited the front pages into a more subdued existence, boardrooms less eager to welcome him, dinners that asked for apologies in place of toasts. Amanda retreated to a narrower orbit. Gavin, stripped of the gloss, attempted, sporadically and with little success, to rebuild a life that would not be defined by convenience. He found work that required him to be in places where he had to admit to mistakes. The humiliation on his part was not a theatrical punishment. It became, if he wanted to make use of it, a rudimentary school of conscience. Clare's life took on a quieter shape. She taught a seminar at her old university one fall, an elective about ethics and economic decision-making, where she used case studies instead of name-calling. Her students were interested in the mechanics of things, how trust works, how power functions, and how dignity can be protected in institutions. She spoke plainly about being underestimated and about the small courage of being visible. At home, she and her mother took to Sunday morning coffee on the small balcony of their apartment, now renovated slightly with new light. The apartment remained modest. Clare had no interest in ostentatious displays. She had learned that ownership is not only about property, but about the stewardship of consequences. She wanted what she controlled to do less harm, not to provide fresh avenues for spectacle. Years from the cathedral, people still asked Clare about the moment the doors had thundered open. She answered with a kind of economy that refused to revel in the Hartwells' fall or to make herself into a parable. It was hurtful, she would say, and then, it was clarifying. She had learned to accept that truth can carry both scar and gift. Sometimes, late at night, when the city outside hummed with its indifferent lights, she would think of the precise cruelty of being told, "You are nothing." The memory stung, but it had been a measuring moment too, the kind that reveals not only the meanness of others, but the architecture you will build from what remains of you. She had chosen a shape that would hold others, not just a trophy for her own vindication. Her father kept his distance in the ways that suited him, present when needed, quiet in his counsel. The method of his teaching had been severe, but it had also been designed to test the structure of character rather than to burn it. He regretted the cost. She forgave him in the ways people forgive those who tried to protect them by strategy rather than care. The moral of Clare's story was not tidy. It did not declare that cruelty ceases once the powerful are exposed. It did not promise that consequences never arrive too late. Instead, it offered something harder, an example of a woman who inherited something not to lavish upon herself, but to transform into a place that reduced harm for others. She exercised her ownership by choosing steadiness over spectacle, by protecting those who could have been collateral damage, and by building programs that taught future generations to measure people by their capacities rather than their proximity to wealth. In the end, the mansion remained a house with many owners in the stories printed about it. Sometimes the Hartwell family in old copy, sometimes Clare's name in newscasts. But to those who knew the work done behind the scenes, it had become a quieter thing, a place for learning, a place where the arithmetic of power had been rewritten in small policies and human commitments. Ownership, Clare discovered, is measured by the choices you make for people whose names you might never read in the society pages. She walked through life with a steadier step, not because she had been made triumphant by headlines, but because she had decided that dignity is not only reclaimed in public reveals, it is also protected by the slow work of doing right when no one is looking. Some nights she returned to the cathedral and sat where she had knelt, not to relive, but to mark how far she'd come. Once, a young woman approached her after a campus talk and said in a voice that held the tremor of remembered shame, "What would you have done if you were me?" Clare thought of the bouquet she had held, of the heavy, cool marble, of the oak doors slamming in judgment and then reopening to reveal a different story. She thought of her father's tests, of Gavin's hollowness, of the Hartwell's calculations. She thought of the small economies of kindness that had carried her. "Watch how they behave when nothing is at stake," she said finally. "Listen to who they truly are in the small rooms, not on the stage. And protect yourself, practically, legally, and emotionally. But don't let revenge steer your life. Make space so others can rise too." Her answer was no sermon. It was an observation, a rule of living she'd learned the hard way. Respect is not a commodity to be priced or traded. It is a practice that either binds a society or lets it crumble. The story of that cathedral night lived on in social chatter and in a few clipped interviews, but for most people it became a private teaching moment. Clare stopped reading every headline. She spent her time building a small program that helped students from backgrounds like hers secure internships and quiet places to study, practical measures that did not cure every injustice but offered a foothold. As for the Hartwells, they learned the uncomfortable lesson that public posture cannot always mask private calculations. Some members retreated into quiet lives. Others were forced to reckon with reputations that do not recover with simple statements. People who had once laughed at a bride's collapse now found their networks thinned and their authority questioned. Those consequences were not spectacular in the movie's sense. They were the slow erosion of advantage until truth had more gravity than the old comforts of influence. Years later, when a journalist asked Clare if she had felt vindicated by the reveal that belonged to her, she shook her head. "Vindication is a curious thing," she said. "It feels shallow if it leaves others in ruins. Accountability is what matters, clear, fair, and aimed at preventing harm. That's what I wanted, and I wanted to make sure the people who lived in that house, who cleaned it, tended it, cooked there, were not the ones to suffer for other people's mistakes." Her voice was steady. The man in the photograph beside her, William, smiled in a way that acknowledged their shared complicity and care. He remained at the edges of her life, a quiet force who had taught difficult lessons and paid the price of their delivery. The moral of Clare's story was not meant to be a lesson in revenge. It was a lesson about the dignity owed to every human being, about the small signs people show when their eyes slide away, and about the responsibility of those with power to use it to protect rather than to humiliate. It is easier, in moments of sudden triumph, to pick up a microphone and declare a moral victory. Clare chose a slower path. She used what she had to build space for others, to shore up livelihoods, and to create a place where the architects of cruelty would have fewer places to hide. If this story moved you, tell us where you're watching from and what you would have done in Clare's shoes. Share your thoughts and subscribe for more stories that explore the thin line between power and responsibility.